Okay. So I'm Tom Kesselman. I'm a professor emeritus in the history department and a colleague of Kathy's and a long-time participant in the Cushwa seminar. I go back to 1980. And as we know, this is Kathy's last time as presiding over the seminar. And it's appropriate that we hear some remarks about her achievements at the seminar, but also more broadly as the director of the Cushwa Center. This is a really hard task because the list of accomplishments is long, so I'm going to leave things out. But I did want to emphasize a few things. And the first is, of course, the seminar itself, the kind of flagship of the Cushwa seminar. As we have seen again this morning, Kathy handles this position with grace, intelligence, and a sense of humor. We always look forward to the seminar, and one reason that we've done that over the past few years is because we know it's in the hands of Kathy. So thank you very much for that. And I want to say that Kathy's role in this seminar is not just as chairing the session. She's a teacher. She has brought some hard history to the seminar, and it's been a wonderful learning experience for us over the years as she's put her own stamp on the books selected and the commentators chosen. So the seminar. Second, international connections and global context. Under Kathy's leadership, the Cushwa Center has become a leader in putting American Catholic history and studies into a global context. This was most apparent in April of 2019, I think it was, when over 60 scholars from around the world came for a conference, and the connections established then will resonate well beyond that conference and make Cushwa a central player in the history of global Catholicism. It's a two-way street. Under Kathy's leadership, the Cushwa Center now has a footprint in Europe, especially through all her work with the Rome Gateway, where conferences and lectures are there. And as often as Kathy can get there, she is there. She has been bitten by the European Roman bug in a big way. And as a French historian, I'm especially always gratified when I see that. Third, women, gender, power. We all know Kathy's wonderful scholarship on the history of women and the history of Catholic religious, and that has also been a focal point for her time at the Cushwa Center. And it's also related to the fraught issue of clerical sexual abuse. With the help of a major grant from the university, Kathy ran a 3-year program that concluded with a conference on that issue. And I was at the papers presented at that conference. I remember being very impressed and deeply moved by what I heard. And so under Kathy's leadership, the Cushwa Center is now playing a key role in providing a historical context without which we'll never be able to understand that issue. Hard history, but done beautifully. I circulated last night and asked a few people, younger people, what they thought about Kathy's accomplishments. And one of the things that came up that I didn't have on my list, and I thought, duh, her mentorship with graduate students and post-grads. If you look at the newsletter, which has been upgraded beautifully under Kathy's leadership, you see all the people that she's helped start their careers. So she has been a wonderful mentor as well, and I think that's another important part of her achievement. While she was an administrator, Kathy wrote a major book. This is not an easy thing to do. And the book was so good that it was discussed at a Cushwa seminar in 2019. And that brings us back to the seminar. And I would like then to ask all of us to express our gratitude for Kathy's work. And we look much forward to seeing what comes next in a remarkable career. Thank you.
Well, one of the things it's been my hallmark of being Cushwa director, and as Shana Madonna and others who've worked with me no, I don't like surprises. I like to anticipate absolutely everything, and I did not anticipate that, but I am so grateful, Tom. That was so thoughtful of you, and just, it's been such a privilege to be Cushwa director, and I have a little farewell message printed in from the director column in our newsletter, so it's just it's so hard to express my gratitude for all the relationships and all that I've learned from every scholar that has crossed paths, certainly at the seminar, the books we've read, and the commentators, but the research travel grant recipients through our many programs, all of our conferences. I'm a much better historian, scholar, and teacher because I was director of the Cushwa Center. So thank you. All right, speaking of the newsletter, I want to congratulate and thank Philip and Shane for getting this newsletter, which is such a gem for people in the field to review new books and learn about our grant recipients. So don't read it yet, but as soon as the seminar ends, and then because some people have to leave early, we always announce the next seminar date at this midpoint in the seminar. So we will be gathering, well, you will be gathering on Saturday, October 7th, to discuss Lerone Martin's wonderful book, The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover. And two wonderful commentators, our Inside Notre Dame commentator, Darren Dochuk, who's here today, and Kristen Kobes-Dumais from Calvin University, whose book many of you will recall, Jesus and John Wayne, we discussed in this very room about a year and a half ago. So that is going to be another great seminar. But let's get back to the business at hand. The floor is now open for questions, and I know that all three of our panelists are eager to engage, and so feel free to direct your questions to one of them or to all of them, and we'll open up what will be a great discussion. And Peter, thank you. Please. We do have the microphone for purposes of the recording.
Thanks. Peter Tucson from IUPUI. If you'll indulge a little personal anecdote, in 1910, my great aunt, who was a Lutheran, well, I should pause and say, you all are probably thinking, how old is he if his great aunt in 1910 was going as a missionary somewhere? But she was the oldest in the family. My grandmother was the youngest. But my great aunt, who was a Lutheran from South Carolina, and so I share a Lutheran connection with you, Kathryn, was drawn into the early Pentecostal movement and went as a missionary through a British Pentecostal organization to what was then the Belgian Congo. And she died the following year in Katanga province of the Congo. And I wrote a blog post about her last summer, but one of the things I discovered was that in a British Pentecostal missionary publication, they had a death notice for her, and it said, we remember her cry for the heathen at Edinburgh in 1910. Now, it wasn't the Edinburgh Missionary Conference. It was a smaller Pentecostal gathering being referred to. But I wish I had the text of that. I've wondered, what did she say? What was her cry for the heathen? But the thing that so touched me about your book was in the epilogue, where you talk about, this impulse to help, this humanitarian impulse, and you say on page 274, who am I to throw cold water on their eagerness to help? And so my question is a question really about the classroom. I mean, in working on this project, did it change for you how you present the missionary impulse, this cry for the heathen, if you will, to students? Because it is such a complex, such an ambivalent thing, and I've struggled with that. How do I think about my own great aunt's errand? How do I think about her legacy? So I'd just be interested in any thought you might have.
Yeah. That's such a great question. Is this on? Hello?
Yes.
Oh. First of all, I just want to say Lerone is my colleague. His book is amazing. Please come. Yeah, so to that question, the cry for the heathen, and that just makes me think of some of the titles of these missionary journals, like the Heathen Woman's Friend, for instance, from the late 19th century. But how has this affected my work in the classroom? And I guess I'll say first that to contextualize Stanford students, it's probably quite different from Notre Dame. I don't know exactly about the context here and what the classroom dynamics are like. But at Stanford, students don't talk about religion. They don't like to talk about religion. I actually teach a course there called Is Stanford a Religion? Which is a very introductory, kind of just introductory to basic religious studies theories through the lens of Stanford. And one of the first things that we talk about is, do you ever talk about religion with students in your dorms or otherwise? And they don't. They just don't want to go there. And so I think, when I do talk about missionaries and about this work, I think there is already a kind of assumption among many students at Stanford that missionaries are bad, right? I think that's actually like already kind of a baseline assumption because they're intolerant and exclusivist and, and this and that. And so part of what I try to do is to complicate that actually, because, there might be this assumption that especially 19th century missionaries were intolerant, but at the same time, a lot of students are interested in humanitarian work themselves, right? Like they're interested in going into the Peace Corps or, whatever. And so when I've talked about this work with students, sometimes they'll come up to me afterwards and they'll say, I think I might have written this in the epilogue. They'll say, what should we do with this? We didn't realize that what we want to do is actually part of this longer history. And that's why I say in the epilogue, like, I don't want to throw cold water on that, right? I just want to complicate it and get them to think about why they're doing what they want to do, right? Is it for themselves actually, or is it for the people that they purport to want to be helping? And then to think about that in this longer historical context. But yeah, I mean, I'm still kind of thinking about it and working it out. And I told some people last night that I actually just found out that I'll be going to Hong Kong for a quarter in 2024. And the course that I proposed there is actually on American missionaries in East Asia. So I've never taught a standalone course on missionaries. I think I would get like 2 students at Stanford. I have to teach broader courses. But somehow this course got accepted. So I'm actually really excited to think about these things even more closely. And I want to do it not just through archival sources, but also through fiction, because I think there's been really interesting fiction that's come out recently, and also obviously previously around these questions as well. So I'm thinking about a series that I recently read, R.F. Kuang. You might know of her book Babel that just came out, but she's got an earlier fantasy series called the Poppy Trilogy. That's about, it's kind of a science fictionalized fantasy version of Chinese history, the Opium Wars, the arrival of missionaries. And I'm also thinking of like Min Jin Lee's Pachinko and other works like this about the complexities of Christianization and missionaries. So yeah, thanks. Do you want anything else?
Hi, I'm Tom Gesselman from the University of Notre Dame. I think you know that. I have a question about another category that hasn't come up, and I'd like to hear really all the panelists maybe talk about how it links to heathen and Christian, and that is Jew. It seems to me that it's a separate category, and but I don't know exactly why. And as I was listening to the talks and reading the book, on the one hand, the Jew is not saved, will be in hell. On the other hand, the Jew is the source of Christianity. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that makes the Jew both better and worse than the heathen. Better because it is from where Christians come, and worse because they don't have the excuse of never having heard the message in the first place. So I'd like to hear the panelists talk about how they understand that relationship. And I'd especially be curious if Kathryn can say anything about whether or not her subjects said anything about that issue.
Mm-hmm.
I can start because I probably have the most superficial response. Going back to sort of thinking about the sweeping chronology of the book, your work really sent me down a rabbit hole trying to understand the very early history of Christianity. So, which is all to say that I think that there's a lot of valuable information in sort of like laying out the context in terms of thinking about this sort of move from so-called barbarism or paganism to Christianity, but then also just thinking about sort of this context and this sort of like lingering problem of Jewish folk and the schism between, Christianity that emerges out of what is understood as the Jewish religion, right? Mm-hmm. And sort of, obviously then like, the sort of history of the crucifixion, Jesus being crucified, and this sort of lingering sort of suspicion and anger that's directed towards Jewish folk that, certainly figures into like, a long history of persecution that then, is at a fever pitch in the 19th and 20th centuries. So for me, that was sort of almost front and center in terms of how I then came to regard the earlier part of your book. And certainly it, figures in other places, but that was where it was most prominent.
Do you want me to go next while you're thinking?
Go ahead, or I can.
Two things come to mind. One more simple, one more extreme. So at least in my teaching, one of the things that I often talk about, and in some of my public talks in Spokane about religion and race, I always bring up sort of the ways in which civil rights have been denied to Jewish people in the United States, just as they've been denied to Native American peoples, at times Catholic peoples. If you have to swear on an Old and New Testament that it is the Word of God in order to run for public office in, the state that gets celebrated as being the birthplace of religious freedom, Pennsylvania, right after the American Revolution, well, then how are you categorizing Jewish people? Because they then can't run for public office. The more extreme example is one from my own current neck of the woods. The Aryan nations, who perhaps you've heard about, an incredibly violent paramilitary hate group, whose compound and headquarters are about 45 minutes from Gonzaga's campus in Idaho, shut down in 2002. I have unpublished research because I am afraid of the death threats that I would get, that really gets into a lot of the public flyers that they would leave on people's cars that a colleague of mine kept over the years and gave to me, and the way in which their pamphlets and writings conflate African Americans, though using a different term, and Jewish people, and putting them both under the category that they referred to as mud people, who were many steps below the white, pure Protestant Christian. And so that's a very extreme case. But I also hear a lot of echoes in it with the anti-Semitism that is in current white Christian nationalism, that Jewish people are completely unredeemable because they are this complete other, just like Black people or Native peoples.
Yeah, that's such an important question. I have like all of these random, notes that I'm going to, again, try to make coherent. I think you're absolutely right about Jews being both the source of Christianity, which makes them in some senses better, but also worse because they're seen to have no excuse. And so I think I'm drawing on the work of other scholars again before me, like J. Cameron Carter and Willie James Jennings on Christianity as really focusing on supersessionism, right? That Christianity supersedes Judaism, and that Christians, particularly European Christians, particularly English Protestants, see themselves as God's new Israel. And that's a violent kind of replacement of the Jew in their imagination, right? So they're occupying this space and seeing themselves as doing it better. But I think, so that's kind of the English Protestant side of things, but there's also important work done on particularly the Iberian context. So I'm thinking about like Maria Elena Martinez's work on genealogical fictions and the ways in which the suspicion towards Jews and Muslims in particular in the Iberian context has a lot of similarities with what I was talking about earlier in terms of, scratch the skin and you come to the heathen. Jews and Muslims who converted, who became conversos, became seen as impure. So to have like conversos in your bloodline was seen as a problem, right? And so that people who had conversos in their bloodline did not have limpieza de sangre or purity of blood. And so the suspicion of impurity followed them. And that I think we can see as, related to this kind of idea that heathenism is something that can be traced. On the other hand, though, this idea of having guilt because Jews knew, they knew Jesus but rejected Jesus, was also critically important because for indigenous people, they could sometimes actually claim that they had limpieza de sangre because they did not know, right? They had never had the chance to hear the gospel, and so they weren't like Jews, right? And so in some ways, heathenists then became almost a cleaner category, or a category that signified more a kind of innocence that could be, that could be converted, that could be told the gospel. But that didn't carry this weight of rejection, right? Let's see, what else was I going to say? I guess I'll leave it there. Thank you for that question.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Pete. I also teach in American Studies here at Notre Dame, and I'm Korey's neighbor, 2 doors down. I was thinking about the narrative that intellectual historians like to tell of modern America about cosmopolitanism, about this narrative of William James and the Will to Believe, or Franz Boas and all of his students going to these places, and this effect of coming back and liberalizing American culture. And I was thinking about Gene Zubovich and David Hollinger's work too, in comparison to that and to your work. And I think the question I have is like, does the heathen category kind of make that narrative almost impossible to pursue, or really put a big dent in it? I mean, David Hollinger's very committed to that narrative of an increasing infatuation with science and liberalization and cosmopolitanism and anthropology as a discipline shifting to studying people in new ways. And I thought that your book is a massive intervention into rethinking that, and really helpful, because this point about repetition, the repetition of the heathen category, how does that challenge, my question is, how does that challenge this like progressive cosmopolitan narrative that some intellectual historians like to pursue about modern America?
Yeah.
And thanks for your wonderful book.
Thank you. That was definitely on the mind as I was writing the later part of the book. I think I can't remember exactly which chapter it's in. You've all read the book more recently than me. I have the problem where once something's in print, I can't look at it again because then I'll find things wrong with it that I want to change. But in one of the later chapters, I think I allude to Hollinger's work in particular. And to this narrative of cosmopolitanism and the idea that missionaries or Protestants abroad actually, they became more cosmopolitan and then brought this cosmopolitanism back. I think it's kind of a both and. Again, I guess that's one of the things that I try to do in my work. I don't know if I do it always successfully, but certainly, yes, there's some truth to that, right? And there's other work as well on how missionaries, I think this gets to Peter's question too, how missionaries became changed by their experiences, right? There's a book, I can't remember the name of the author at this point, but it's called The Conversion of Missionaries. And it's about missionaries in China who started questioning things, based on their experiences. I think Emily might be able to speak to this a little bit as well. But at the same time, I guess I do see this as an intervention not to go too far along those lines, right? Because I think
I'm not sure I understand.
I'm not either. I'm not.
Scary.
That was perfect.
Divine intervention.
Siri's not a regular attendee at the seminar. in
Divine
American Religion.
AI.
Yeah, it's a little creepy. yeah, I do think it's an intervention against this kind of progressive narrative because that's an easy narrative to tell ourselves. That again, I think it goes back to this idea of change over time. Like I think, and then to connect to the point about hard histories, I think one way that scholars have engaged in hard histories is to reassure ourselves that they're over, but they're not, right? So I think, and I'm trying to show that they're not, and I'm trying to show that they're not just for conservative fundamentalists, white Christian nationalists, because obviously that, we can see that there, but we can see this in other ways too, right? So, the discourse around third world developing countries, again, connecting this to humanitarianism, and like for my students, many of whom would see themselves as very progressive, very liberal, and yet engaging in, perhaps some of the similar kind of assumptions about the world out there. What does that mean, right? They might see themselves as cosmopolitan, but to what end, I guess? Yeah.
One of the, to speak specifically to this question around William James, I mean, one of the people who you discuss in the book is G. Stanley Hall, who's James's colleague at Harvard, and he doesn't come off particularly well in this book in terms of thinking about his anxieties and preoccupations about the heathen. And, in my own research and looking into both James and looking into Pushkin, G. Stanley Hall is fundamentally opposed to racial mixing, right? So that's sort of, I think, front and center with his own concerns about the heathen. And in many ways, William James represents a very different kind of tradition for a couple different reasons. I mean, his colleagues both see him as this only slightly redeemed Irish person, right? And they refer to him as Irish and, sort of have ways of racializing him in those terms. And then this, I think, in some ways figures into his own sort of understanding and appreciation for this varieties of religious experience per se, as a means of perhaps thinking about, something that's more pluralist, something that's more cosmopolitan. So even as he's sort of not represented in the book, it sort of, I think, affirmed a way of some things that I've been thinking about James in this context at the turn of the century.
So I know we have a question from Rachel. Emily, do you have a question on this point, or is it you want to respond on this point?
Not to respond, no.
Okay.
I have a question building on it, but we can hop back.
Okay. Well, Rachel?
Yeah, Rachel Whaler from IUPUI, and I've got a question that I think builds from both Peter's and Tom's, and I'm thinking of a specific instance from my research where there's a missionary, I think I remember that his name is Levi Parsons, and he's about to head off on a tour to the Holy Land to try to convert the Jews in 1816, and he stops in to the Stockbridge Mohicans, who have now already been displaced, and they're in upstate New York. And no, sorry, they're farther than that. Anyway, I don't remember exactly where they are at that point, but he takes up a collection among the Stockbridge Mohicans for this missionary tour, and then there's a recorded speech by the Mohican sachem Oppomet, who tells the history of, John Sargent came to us and we learned about the Bible, and from that we know that, we all descend from one man and one woman, and therefore I call you brother. And this speech is addressed to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob encamped around the city of Jerusalem. And he takes up a collection of $5.87. And this speech is to be brought to the Jews in the Holy Land. And he says, if we remain faithful, then one day, and he uses a native word, he says, we will meet here, where there is no white, there is no black, there is no red. And it's so what do we do with this story? And what does it mean for how we narrate American history? On the one hand, his story could be told as how Native peoples are not, are the subject of an America that is oppressive and does not count, that is continually displacing Native peoples. On the other hand, what happens to the narrative of American history if he is a profoundly American thinker? Mm-hmm. So this question about how do we talk to students and what narratives, and so these hard histories, which are absolutely American histories, but how do we reckon with the oppomates?
Yeah, that's an amazing example. Thank you for sharing that. So just one thing that I just wanted to go back to Pete's question just really quickly, because I was jotting this down. In addition to G. Stanley Hall, I think another academic from the 20th century that I found really interesting and problematic was William Henry Howells, whom I wrote about, briefly, his book on the Heathen, which actually was brought to me by a graduate student at Stanford after I gave a talk about this one time. And he said, this was this is the mid-2010s, right? So pretty recent. And this grad student said, this is a book I had to read in my anthropology class as an undergrad, which, this was not a very old grad student, so that would have been in the 2000s. That book is still being used. It's still being reprinted. And in some ways, you could see that book is very cosmopolitan, because Howells talks about how we should have an appreciation for, quote unquote, primitive man, the heathen, et cetera. But that just firmly goes into this kind of preservationist impulse that, that I think we continue to see in academic disciplines as well, that, we're cosmopolitan now because we're the ones who are recording this and preserving this, which is obviously super problematic. So Rachel, that's an incredible story. And so I guess the first thing that I'll say to that, so I think the way to teach that, I would love to hear if you've taught it, how you've done that, is again to make it as complicated as possible, right? And I think it's that goes back to what I was trying to say earlier about how I've tried to treat and write about people dubbed heathens who have converted to Christianity, to treat them as doing that in a complicated way and not to just dismiss them as, because it'd be easy, right, to just dismiss that as, well, they're colonized and they're, giving this speech because that's what's expected, and they're giving money because that's what's expected of them. But, what if we actually start from the premise that, no, they actually believe this? So first of all, what does it mean to believe something like that, right? What is this category of belief? But what if we actually take them seriously, or take them at their word? What kind of world are they imagining? What does the idea of monogenesis, the idea that everyone is descended from the same original parents, what kind of worldview does that engender, right? And what kind of, you said that in the speech, they said, if we remain faithful one day, we will meet again with no whites, that reminds me of what Emily was saying about the spirits being light. What kind of racial worldview does that, entail? And then also to think about the context, the audience, because the audience is on the one hand, both people in the Holy Land that this speech is going to be printed for, but it's also presumably, the people who are in attendance there, it's presumably American audiences, white American audiences too, who are going to be receiving this in a different kind of way, right, as evidence of a kind of missionary success. I guess that's how I would try to approach that, is to just offer like a multiplicity of narratives, a multiplicity of ways that one could interpret this source, and then
It's easier to interpret historical context than in its meaning for what is America, and your students' questions about, like, how do we envision a future? Right, that if America by definition in hard histories is one that is oppressive of heathens, does that then again say that Oppomet is not, who is he in that story?
No, that's right. It is, from my perspective, that is also an American story, because it is a hard history of, America being oppressive of heathens, but American history is also a story of so-called heathen people, again, kind of re-signifying, reclaiming that term, and there's plenty of examples of that. So,
They're connecting with the Jews as another diaspora people.
Right.
So it's a critique. There's a critique of American imperialism
Right.
in this connection with this other diaspora.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, to think with there is that, America, we have to understand it in a global context, right? That's critically important. So, yeah, I'm actually thinking for my next book about writing about two of the subjects in Heathen from the chapter on Chinese exclusion, Wang Chin-fu and Yan-Fao Li. So Wang Chin-fu writes the piece called Why Am I a Heathen? And Li writes a rejoinder, Why I'm Not a Heathen. But I think there are similar questions there around what is this, how does this fit into this questions about what is America? Mm-hmm. Are these figures writing from an American perspective, right? Again, like it's complicated. Yeah. I don't know if you wanna...
Yeah, this is one thing. I don't want to end up talking about spiritualism, but that often happens when you have me in a room. And the group in New Orleans, they were known as the Sœurs Carmeniques, and many of them came from Haitian roots. And they got one spirit message where it was very important that the spirit made very clear that what they were not doing was voodooism. That this was something very different from what their own ancestors might have practiced in Haiti. And yet, at the same time, there were plenty of people in New Orleans practicing voodoo. I have an article on that that's and making the argument that New Orleans voodoo is an American religion. And it's always sort of struck me when they're critical of their own ancestors while at the same time receiving all of these messages that are about equality for all. And that, Black people are on the rise. We are moving towards a true republic. And so there's sort of this like embrace of, this world where race won't matter, while at the same time having, it seems almost like a little bit of disappointment in their own ancestors, and a disappointment in some of their own, brothers and sisters in the city who come from similar roots. And so when I've taught about voodoo and spiritualism in New Orleans, in my bad religion class right now, that's one of the things that we really wrestle with is the complexity of who's calling voodoo a bad religion. It's both white newspaper articles, white authors, but also Black men who believe they're speaking with the dead, who are related to them. What do we do with that? And that's one of my favorite teaching strategies, is always like embracing all the complexity and then just asking them, what do we do with that? And have them sit with that question.
Oh, Linda, did you have a question? No, sorry.
Thank you. Kathryn, I want to echo Emily earlier that your work has helped me think through so many questions about my work and sort of rethink a lot of the things I do. And so I want to kind of build a little bit off of Pete's question with a twist. Mm-hmm. Not so much thinking about sort of the progressive cosmopolitan narrative here, but one of the things that your work has really sort of helped me grapple with and think more about is, sort of the lumping or splitting kind of categories, right? And so one of the things that is happening at the same time as we have this sort of heathen category sort of transcending time and sort of lumping all these folks together is that these same groups of missionaries and white Protestants in America are also really invested in categorizing those groups of folks and sort of in the tradition of knowledge production as a kind of power. And one of the things that I sort of listening to you over the years and being on panels together and reading your book now, I've sort of sitting with that both and question, and it's been a really productive tension for me. And I wonder if you can sort of talk a little bit more about how do you sort of coming at the end of writing the book sort of think through that theme of both sort of heathen as this big category that is sort of lumping all sorts of folks together, but also sort of the power of sort of dividing amongst, ranking the heathen against each other and sort of trying to sort of think about sort of how is change possible for certain groups versus others, and the power of sort of white Protestants doing that work.
Yeah. So I will just echo you and say that I've learned so much from you, particularly on this question, from our conference panels together, but also from your book, Christian Imperialism, and the idea of hierarchies of heathenism, right? Because that's straight from your research and from your book. Actually, I think, in the penultimate version of this manuscript, I think I had leaned kind of too far in the direction of lumping. So the same reader who asked me, how is the heathen different from the quote unquote savage or barbarian, also asked me about, I had used the word undifferentiated a number of times to refer to the quote unquote heathen world. And this reader said, but it wasn't undifferentiated, because even at the same time as they are, in these maps of the world, as the quote unquote heathen world, it's all colored the same color, right? It's all like gray or brown or something like that. But at the same time, as your work has shown, missionaries are absolutely differentiating, right? They're like dividing and subdividing and categorizing. And so, that comment really kind of made me go back and think about how to make it more of the both and, as opposed to leaning too far in the direction of the lumping. So I guess and I don't know if I sufficiently did that, but I guess the way that I'm thinking about it now, and especially as I'm leaning more into the work that I'm doing now on Chinese exclusion and on this particular population, is to think about the uses of lumping and the uses of splitting, right? And I'm thinking about that also in relationship to how race has been conceptualized, right? So I think that absolutely splitting has been used to set groups against each other. And here I'm thinking of racial hierarchies and the ways in which, so racial hierarchies that, set, in the 19th century, set people of the world on ladders of so-called, development based on pseudoscience or whatever. Those align with the kind of splitting that missionaries are trying to do kind of on the ground. It aligns with the civilizational hierarchies that you've written about. And I think that the utility of those hierarchies or of those ladders, if we think about race as colonial governance, is to keep groups apart, right? Is to try to keep them apart, to try to triangulate them against each other. So thinking about the Chinese in particular, and this continues to this day, right? The model minority myth is used to triangulate Chinese people of Asian descent, particularly against African Americans, in a very, very problematic, divisive way, right? So then what is lumping for, though? So lumping, I think, serves to then create, so racial hierarchies work in one way. It creates a racial binary that becomes useful when particular groups, like Chinese immigrants, buy into this idea of a racial ladder and of being the model minority, and then start to threaten whiteness as the top of the ladder, at a position at the top of the ladder, right? Because the model minority myth, according to some people, shows that Asian people are the next in line to become white. And so that's threatening, and that's been threatening for a very long time. I think that kind of threat actually underlay some of the arguments for Chinese exclusion, right? Because in the 19th century, attitudes towards the Chinese really changed from, wow, this is an ancient empire and they're so much older than we are, and what does this say about us, to, but they're heathens, right? So that kind of lumping, they're heathens, they just belong into this larger, broad category of heathens, helps to sweep them off those ladders into what I call the heathen umbrella or the heathen blanket. So it's another way of racial governance that they work hand in hand in different contexts. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about it now. But again, like, your work has just been so important to me in thinking about these issues too. So I don't know.
I think the theme is represented again in this work from the start, and in no small part from your discussion of Aristotle, and how that then, as distinct from the Platonic tradition, something that's a little bit more ambivalent in relation to like questions around categorizing. So then we, of course, then get back into how this figures into like legacies of monogenetic thought versus like polygenesis, and then thinking about how that then like figures into like how people like are teaching these things like in the 20th century. I think one of the noteworthy pieces of the Howells book, if I'm not mistaken, is still measuring skulls, well after Boaz at that point, as a means of kind of thinking about how sort of antiquated and deeply problematic that is. So that certainly there's some bearing in terms of how we understand this and how we interpret and articulate race and the fiction of race in the classroom. So this is something that's certainly come up in classrooms here. Like some of my students, including some of my students who are science majors who've never even been exposed to this concept of race as a construct, right? And sort of thinking about, how that then ebbs and flows across this text, because there's not a particular kind of trajectory where we get away from this lumping and the splitting, but you see a kind of ebbing and flowing, I think, across time and space that's, very eloquently put in your work.
Daryl Hart from Hillsdale College. Related to this question of splitting and lumping, also in relation to religious studies versus history and change over time, but it does seem to me that historical methods change over time could point different points where heathen become Christian. The one that stands out, especially in relation to empires, which is sort of hinted at here but not fully developed, when, say, the Venerable Bede is accounting the way Christianity comes to Britain, or think about Charlemagne and that Holy Roman Empire stuff. So thinking about that, thinking about American Christians, American Protestants in the 19th century engaged in missions, which has perhaps an imperial dimension to it, but doesn't really have that kind of imperial dimension the way you have in the medieval world. But then pointing forward to the 20th century, when the United States does become a global power, and thinking about some of the mainline Protestants who are friends with people like Ernest Hocking, who's writing the study of missions. And so change over time might help you sort out which of those is different and why, and whether some are harder, and hardest even. So I'm just curious if history might actually help sort some of this out.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think the question of how to categorize these different missionary ventures, these different projects, is harder or hardest. I think could certainly, I think a scholar could certainly do that if that's something that they were interested in tracing over time in that particular way. I think that my project is not, and this could be something that's, depending on where you're coming from or what your particular disciplinary perspective is, you could certainly take issue with how much I am trying to kind of push back against change over time. And I think that's also in some ways a side effect of the fact that this tries to cover many centuries in 400 pages, is that some of those differences may be glossed over in a way that a much longer book could get into more detail. But I think the overall argument that I'm trying to make, I think I'm not so interested in teasing out differences in these kinds of missionary projects, because I'm more interested in tracing what the similarities have been. So I think, if you're interested in tracing the differences, absolutely, scholars have done that. Scholars can do that. I think there could be, more synthetic work that tries to categorize the differences between Christianization projects along those lines. But that's not so much what this particular book is trying to do. But I appreciate that. Yeah.
So all of my training is in religious studies or anthropology, with, save, I think, like 2 graduate history courses. So change over time is a big phrase in history and in religious studies, we have kind of another way, a very similar but also different way of thinking about comparison. Thinking about the very famous article by Jonathan Z. Smith, The Magic of Comparison, that in comparison, a magic dwells. And just thinking about some of my research on the Jesuit missions in Alaska, missionaries working in the same, very similar places had very, very different takes at times on Indigenous Alaskan culture and how to engage it from a missionary perspective. So, there's Father Bellarmine Le Fortune, who criticized fellow Jesuits for saying that Indigenous Alaskan food was gross. And he was like, basically, man up and stop complaining. And he was the same one who was fascinated by masking ceremonies and traditional dances and encouraged them to keep getting practiced, even as he was probably the most successful missionary in terms of building a Catholic community amongst them. And then on the converse, there were many Jesuits, colleagues of him, people that he wrote letters with, who constantly made fun of the indigenous practices and wanted to get rid of them, saw them as heathenism, saw them as nothing but superstition, wrote in very boastful ways when they had bested a medicine man by being able to bring Western medicine to people in need. And there's something about comparing those missionaries who were working in a very similar place at the same time that doesn't show change over time, but shows like comparison in a different way. And then it all gets more complicated when I find out that who had been one of my favorite missionaries also sexually abused Indigenous children. That was perhaps a soul-crushing day for me when the list of abusers for Jesuits West was announced in December of 2018. Actually completely changed my ASCH paper to be about that. And so comparing even missionaries from the same order working in the same region at the same time can also get at comparison in another way.
Mary, thank you.
Mary Caton from Miami University Emerita and currently affiliated with Ohio State. I want to express deep appreciation for this book, for the research. I really loved it as a scholar who works particularly with 18th and 19th century materials. It changed the way I see things. Thank you. And I hope this won't be an ungrateful question. When I look at the latter half of it, I wonder about your choice of shaping the narrative as continuity over time versus change over time. Mm-hmm. And maybe that works better for me with the earlier materials because I'm further away from them. But I'll give you a little bit of background on my own perspective that leads me to ask questions. I was raised Catholic, so in the 1960s, pre and post Vatican II, we were adopting pagan babies and we were putting little quarters or little dimes into Lenting cards to send to the missions to convert people there. And during the same decade, I'm reading Mary Noel missionary literature that has nothing like that perspective. I think as a historian of the fragmentation and almost bifurcation of viewpoints about the United States since the 1960s, I think about my current affiliation with Episcopalianism in the United States and the issues both in Catholicism and in the Anglican Communion with the influence of the Global South and the impact that that has had on denominations in the United States. And I'm wondering if that form of narrative that you chose, the continuity, really masks some important differences since 1960. And you know, probably if I were in 1820, I might say the same thing, but I'm not. So the continuities make perfect sense there. But it seems as though we're in a moment in this country where Americans don't agree on ideology. What do you make of that? What do we do with that?
Yeah, that's I think that's right? Like, I think it's both. And I think this traces to Pete's question as well about these different kinds of narratives and these different kinds of emphases. And so, again, I'm not trying to say that the kind of Hollinger narrative of increasing cosmopolitanism, increasing fragmentation, changes in denominations, the influence of the global South. I'm not trying to say that those aren't important or that these changes don't happen. But I think there's been a lot of emphasis on that, right? There's been a lot of emphasis on these changes and on what's happening to the main line. But at the same time, I think that, focusing primarily on change lets too much off the hook, right? So, I think that's a choice that I made. Like, I absolutely, and I think readers can certainly disagree with that. And I welcome that disagreement, and I welcome that engagement and that kind of conversation. But for me, I think it was important as a kind of, I guess, as Pete put, an intervention or a kind of corrective to the prominence of those narratives. Because even in these denominations that have been influenced by, I grew up also putting, pennies in little loaves for people from the quote unquote heathen world. I participated in these kinds of discourses in the 1990s, and now I no longer attend the denomination that I grew up in. I attend a mainline denomination, but that denomination also is engaging in, even as they are critical of, they're still sending, teenagers on 1-week mission trips in the summers for. Again, like, I think the question rises for whom are these trips, to whose benefit are these trips? They still engage in there's sponsorship programs that are still happening at a lot of these denominations, and they might not, they do not use the same language, and that's one of the changes over time that I try to trace in the book, that the language does change. But you can see, I think you can see so many continuities still, right? And that's what I'm trying to call attention to, I guess, right? So it's no longer sponsorship for the sake of converting a so-called heathen soul. It's sponsorship for the sake of bringing clean water or, livestock or something like that. But one of the points that I try to make in the book, and this connects to Emily's comment about the material realities of this language, is that 19th century missionaries were also they were also consumed with material realities, right? The material significance of the category of heathen. So it's not like you see this massive change between 19th century missionaries who are focused on souls and 20th century humanitarians who are focused on clean water. 19th century missionaries were also focused on the realities of on the ground living in the so-called heathen world. Yeah, that's why I made the choice. But again, I think certainly you could write, and historians have written very different kinds of books that emphasize change.
I'll admit it, I'm obsessed with change over time, which really aggravates my students. So, I try to qualify things and, tell them that they can point out patterns and similarities and so forth and so on. But I think that, these questions around sort of change over time are really productive. To reiterate something that Kathryn's already said, and sort of pointed to in terms of how this book is laid out, there are a number of choices that you would have had to have made to tell such a big, ambitious story, which is, really difficult as something that I know as, someone who just finished my first book, but is a reflection of the kind of choices that one, necessarily make when they are, articulating and trying to transmit such a big history. So the way that I see this book is, one that is almost like sort of opening up a field, so to speak, right? Hopefully this isn't the last word on the so-called heathen in terms of how scholars will then come and put this together and, future studies and generations and so forth. and so on. So, to think specifically about this stuff, I think I'm really sort of intrigued about sort of the lumping in relation to empire and imperialism, right? It seems to become like especially sort of compelling or salient to sort of see these groups together when it, is to the advantage of a place like the United States to annex Hawaii, for example, or the way that this might have worked in relation to Irish before home rule was achieved in 1920 and so forth and so on, so that, the way that these empires work are really sort of like under the auspices of Christianity or civilization when, the real sort of imperative is often something that's much more pernicious or something, as your book will point out, that will point to like questions around business and capitalism and so forth and so on, and Christianity being used as a type of rhetoric. And as you so eloquently put it, you can never quite assimilate or never quite become Christian. There's always something sort of like underneath one's skin that points to their so-called heathenish.
Tom Tweed, and then we have David Lantigua, and then Brad. Tom, please.
Hi, I'm Tom Tweed. I'm from American Studies and History and colleagues with all those folks. Thank you so much, Kathryn, for this wonderful book. I'm mostly asking a question for advice for graduate students and early career folks who are mostly in history. And the observation is, I'm really interested in thinking about whether we lump or not lump categories, not so much people. The subtitle is about religion and race. There's no index entry for the word religion. There is an index entry for religio-racial identity. And so I'm just thinking mostly of our friends around the room who are thinking about how do I write about religion that it might be received broadly by multiple kinds of audiences. And you've given one kind of strategy. I think you quote Judith's New Worlds book, if I remember correctly. Yeah. If you could just sort of say a little bit, how do you think they might approach the question of how to write about it and how to talk about those categories?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I never realized that the index doesn't have religion. Thank you for bringing that up. I had a wonderful indexer, Joseph Stewart. He's indexed a lot of books in American religion, and he's great. But yeah, both of us looked. He'll
be getting an email from us after this.
Oh,
no,
great.
yeah,
he's wonderful. And both of us looked over the index multiple times, so that's a good. Thank you. So how? I mean, I think Korey and Emily maybe can also weigh in on this. How can graduate students in history write about religion in a way that gets people outside of the study of religion to read it and to be interested in it? I mean, again, all my training was in history departments, and I think that for me, that led me to initially write about religion in a way that I think was maybe a little bit less complicated, right? So for my first book is about hell, the idea of hell in America, primarily in the 19th century. And I remember that I gave job talks about this book in religion departments where my takeaway in the initial dissertation version of that book was, look, religion matters, right? Religion is important. And at Princeton, actually, I remember Jeff Stout was like, okay, great, but then what? Right? Like, what does that do? What do we do with that? And I think that question has just really stuck with me kind of ever since. Like, you can't just stop at religion matters. How does it matter? Why does it matter? For what does it matter? And so I think for this book, I try to, by connecting religion to processes of racialization, I'm trying to make a claim about how religion matters to race. And maybe that's why, race and religio-racial identity are in the index, but not religion. So that scholars of the history of, racial formation, scholars of critical race and ethnic studies might come to it through that lens, who might not be interested in religion and realize that, oh, actually, this has something to say about that. So that's kind of where, I constantly think about Jeff's question, and maybe that's a way to help grad students who are similarly inclined to think about how to make their work speak outside of the field. Okay, it matters, so what? So then what? Yeah. Thanks.
I just echo what Kathryn said, the reframing of you need to be able to show how it matters rather than just tell how it matters. I think the history books that try to engage with religion that frustrate me the most are the ones that it's basically just like, look, religion, now moving on. And so being able to get into, don't just tell me about it, show me why it is important to the change over time story that you're telling in a way that's just not, look, I found the religion. Like, okay, now what? So I think that's, when I hear historians trained only in history talk about religion, that's when I get frustrated, is when it just stops with like, I found it. Good for you.
David?
Yes, David Lantigua. I'm in the Department of Theology here at University of Notre Dame. And I just really appreciate that you bring up Jennings' work to think about this question and the way that it was asked earlier by Tom about the relationship between how Christians view Jews going a long way in thinking about these kinds of categorizations that later get deployed in colonial contexts. I mean, I'd also want to recommend Jonathan Boyarin's book, who Paul Coleman actually introduced to me when I was a grad student. I don't know if he's still here.
Paul just had to pop out, but he was a big
The
fan.
Unconverted Self, Jews, Indians, and Christian, The Making of Christian Identity, I think is the subtitle or something like that. But that's a wonderful book, too, to think about this question, about the application of these categories. I mean, one thing that really strikes me about the heathen category as you're using it in this book, in the 19th century kind of social, cultural location and its deployment is how fluid it is. I mean, it really kind of tracks onto, or draws from this tradition of thinking about infidels that you see in the history of pagans and the history of Christianity, but also savages, both and, right, as it seems to be deployed here. I mean, the infidel category, of course, is a way of demarcating those who are baptized. Typically, that's how it was used in canon law. And then savage, of course, is very much associated with a certain way of life. So I really just like how you're using this term heathen to talk about kind of broken bodies and barren landscapes. And the question that I have is, well, one is there's two. The application of this term heathen. I mean, I think what you're doing in the book that's I find very important for contrasting with, say, Jennings and Boyarin is you're not just giving a kind of, colonized dialectic here, but you're actually showing the agency that heathens have, right, and kind of using it as a reflexive category. And so how does that term get deployed in today? This is one question. How does the term heathen get deployed today in kind of American evangelical context, particularly with prosperity gospel and its global kinds of vision and ways that it's tied to economic development? I'd be curious to hear more about that. The other is you talk about the virtues of heathens, and as you also mentioned, there's a pagan virtue tradition in Christianity that's very interesting that emerges as well in colonial context as a way of trying to assess the rationality of pagan peoples. Right. So is there, if you can talk about heathens having justice, then you can also kind of make the next step, which does happen in among different thinkers in history, to talk about the rights of heathens. And so did you find that, I know that's kind of a different aspect of your area of focus, not looking so much at the legal kind of appropriation of this language, but I'd just be curious to hear if you have more to say about that.
Yeah, those are great questions. Okay, so let's see, let me just look at my notes here. How does the term get deployed today? I mean, the term, I think, is not so much deployed today, right, clearly. And I think there are different terms that have come in its stead. We've already talked about third world, developing world, but in a missions context, in a kind of global missions context, other terms like unreached peoples, frontier peoples, the 1040 window, these have all come in its stead. But then in terms of the kind of like reflexive and how that can be flipped around, right? So it's not just a dichotomy of colonized. I think in the missions context, you do see people kind of actually reclaiming. I mean, so in the missions context in the last chapter of the book, you see people reclaiming the term third world in particular, right? So I write about the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians and how they are using that term third world again as a kind of badge of like, okay, you're going to call us this, third world. Okay, that's who we are, right? And that is not something to be ashamed of, right? Just as some people in the 19th century did the same with the term heathen. And you also see these theologians writing specifically about the third world as a non-Christian world and writing about that as not a bad thing, again, right? That there are things to learn from, the eruption of the third world, from the eruption of non-Christian cultures that can be brought into conversation, and not just be denigrated as antithetical to Christianity. I think outside of the missions context, and actually outside of the language of like third world developing country, I've been thinking about, what is a kind of reclamation of the idea of the lumping nature of heathenness that we can see today. And I actually think there are interesting ways that people have adopted this notion that, because heathen is the lumping character of the heathen, and the way that it was used by people called heathen as a marker of pride. One of the key aspects of that was the solidarities that they could find with other people in that so-called heathen world, right? So what are other terms that have come to stand in for that kind of solidarity? Interestingly, I actually think that the term ethnic is one of these terms, or ethnic studies. And ethnic is an interesting word because it really does trace back very directly to heathen, right? That the term ethnic, actually once meant heathen, or could be used interchangeably with heathen. And now I think actually the term ethnic studies denotes it's this kind of comparative, approach. And I've actually had people tell me, kind of in a laughing way, I'm in the heathen department, right? Like academically speaking. Anybody who doesn't study like a particular kind of history, who sees their work as part of this broader narrative, like they've said, I'm in heathen studies. So I think ethnic is one of these terms. I've been thinking a lot actually about Black, Indigenous people of color as a kind of lumping term, and whether and how we can think of that as maybe part of a tradition of pushing back against, or reclaiming in this kind of reflexive way, the notion of the heathen as a lumping category that is not something to be ashamed of. But I'm still, just kind of still playing with that, thinking about that. The rights of heathens, if heathens have justice, and the legal aspects of that. That's something that I didn't do so much in this book as you recognize, and that would be wonderful for somebody to take up. As Korey mentioned, I think there's a lot of things that could be taken up by other scholars if they're so interested, and that would be one of them, absolutely.
I was really, surprised in relation to, I'm thinking about this in relation to what you just said about sort of the heathen department, or sort of the sort of like historic roots of ethnic or ethnicities. And, one of the things I was surprised to find is, sort of the hostility to teaching the classics and teaching sort of like these like so-called pagans in the 18th and 19th century, because it's almost sort of flips the logic on its head of sort of like how we understand the canon today, right? With the canon being sort of almost synonymous with something that's almost Christian and sort of unproblematized, but then was actually really problematic for some folks in the 18th and 19th century. So I don't think that would be intuitive in terms of how we understand sort of education and ways of understanding departments and understanding sort of what we understand as sort of like the apex of like intellectual thought and so forth and so on. So in some ways, David, hopefully this speaks to sort of, which obviously comes up in the book, like this question of like the so-called virtues of like people who are heathen or pagan and so forth and so on. So I think that's something that you deal with quite productively in your work.
Okay, before Brad's question, I'll just note we're coming to the end of our time together this morning. And I will invite our panelists to do kind of a final word. So if you want to think about that, but Brad, please.
I'm Brad Gundlach. I teach at Trinity College north of Chicago. Korey mentioned at the beginning of his comments that your book has this broad sweep, which of course it does, and beginning with the Greeks. And when I was reading the beginning of the book, I was kind of struck that you started with the Greeks and didn't start with the Bible. Because in the Bible, of course, it seems to me that the beginnings of this notion of the heathen is tied up with the notion of the chosen people. And the promise to Abraham in Genesis 12 that in him all the nations of the world shall be blessed. And repeatedly in the Old Testament, the chosen people are told that they are chosen not because of any merit of their own. And it seems to me that had you started there, it might have set your narrative on maybe a more complicated trajectory. So I'm curious as to why you didn't start there, and what would starting there do to change the book?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, it starts with the Greeks, but only with a couple pages. So I'll just say that first as a, I'm not at all a specialist in the first chapter. I really had to draw a lot on secondary sources because that's not my area. But yeah, I was trying to trace kind of the etymology of the term, and so that's how, I was interested in how we could trace that back to this notion of the barbarian. First of all, like what does the barbarian signify? Those who are outside of the city-states, and then the term pagan, right? So I was really interested in just understanding that term and where that came from, and then how that turns into the idea of the heathen. So it was really a kind of etymological decision there. But if I had started with the Bible, I mean, that's an interesting question. And I think the book is definitely interested in how the notion of the heathen is caught up with the idea of the chosen people. But you're right that it comes up a bit later, right? So particularly in the chapters on landscapes and bodies, I'm really looking at how missionaries are interpreting the Bible, interpreting Scripture, what Scripture says about unbelievers, what it says about heathens, and applying that to their particular contexts. Because, I mean, it's an American history, right? So again, like the Greeks are very minimally part of it. And if I were to have started with biblical history, I mean, I don't know that would have changed the argument so much. I mean, I appreciate your comment that could have brought a different kind of complexity, because the chosen people are not chosen through any particular merit, right? So that could have brought a different kind of complexity to the story. But I think that part of what we see in the American context is that the occupation of the position of chosen people, right? This kind of supersessionism, notions of merit get attached to that, right? And racialized notions of merit get attached to that. And so what this book is really primarily interested in is how Americans have interpreted these biblical ideas, not so much in the history, not so much in the history of the Bible, but in the interpretation of it, if that makes sense, in a particular context. Yeah.
Kathryn, Brad asked about where you start. I want to finish by asking a little bit about the decision about where to end. And specifically for those who are writing books, we know editors don't often like in history books to pin it to a particular chronological moment. Right. So I loved the epilogue. I thought the COVID story just aligned so perfectly with your thesis. But I wondered if you could talk about that decision and how that came about and what it was like to be writing, to finish things up during COVID.
Yeah, it was a challenge. The epilogue has been divisive, and it was divisive before the book even went into print. The readers of the book, one of them really liked it and said, bring more of this into it, bring more of this into the beginning. And one of them said, don't do that. Just save that for an op-ed. Again, it's going to date the book. It's going to peg it to this particular moment. My editor actually didn't really push me one way or the other. So it was, I think, ultimately my decision what to do with that. And the reason why that's there, I mean, I just felt that it couldn't not be there, because anybody, reading this book can see the publication dates of the book, 2022. Something had to have changed, but also not changed, right? Which is kind of the point of the epilogue. And it was just such a difficult moment for me, thinking about the hard nature of the book. I was finishing the first draft of it just when the lockdowns happened, and to see, the anti-Asian rhetoric, it just was so similar to what I had been seeing from the 19th century, down to the very language itself. The Chinese wet markets must go. That's one of the articles that I talk about in the epilogue. That's a direct echo of Dennis Kearney's The Chinese Must Go from the late 19th century. Dennis Kearney, Irish-American labor leader who was one of the most outspoken opponents of the Chinese. And so it just felt dishonest not to include that, not to write about that, because it was so present. And I think this is maybe another thing that has changed for me as I have, I was, again, trained in a history department. For my first book, I really... I was trained to be an objectivist historian. Don't put yourself in the text. Nobody should be able to learn who you are or where you're coming from in reading this book. And for this book, I just felt that was impossible, right? Both because this is a history that's so close to my own, and this is a history that I feel like I've had to write kind of for myself, again, as an insider outsider, to understand where I'm coming from. And so I saw the epilogue as a kind of continuation of that, I guess. If I was going to put myself in there in the beginning, I guess, why not? Why not end with that? And all histories are dated to a particular time, and to suggest otherwise, I think is not accurate. And so, maybe one day somebody will use this as a primary source, and that's fine.
And I was also very moved by you referring to yourself as a primary source in the prologue. All right, Korey and Emily, do you have any final thoughts, final reflections? And we'll give Kathryn the very last word.
Sure. First, I wanted to say I did not mean to sound as snarky as I did in response to Tom's question. If that came off snarky, sometimes I come off snarky. So one of the things that I didn't say, and I'm glad that Kathy brought this up, is one of my favorite parts about this book is when you get into what I would call the personal real talk. Thinking about, as you were finishing up the book in, the protests over the murder of George Floyd, the COVID-19 pandemic, rising anti-Asian hatred, in the prologue when you talked about your own, personal history with it. One of the things that I think about is students, because we've talked about teaching some, undergraduate students love saying, well, this text has a bias, so I can't trust it. And it's just like, well, everyone has a bias because everyone has life experiences. And so one of the things that I really appreciate, and I don't think it dates the book at all, is that you acknowledge that in ways we're all part of the academic stories that we write. I wrote a full first draft of my book on material spiritualism while on sabbatical during what people call, the worst of the COVID, like the worst COVID year. And so I spent all day reading about people grieving, people using technology to try to connect with the dead, while then reading newspaper stories about ICU nurses holding iPads in front of people who were dying so that they could say goodbye to their loved ones. And there was something very striking about researching and writing about death, grief, and people's belief in connecting with the afterlife as there is a mass global death event happening. And so, I have a little bit about COVID at the very end of the book manuscript, and you've definitely inspired me that if someone tries to get me to take it out, it's only a couple of lines. I'm just going to be like, nope, it stays.
We both came to this on our own, and we've certainly, discussed it in relation to the conversation that we've had, which I've found to be incredibly stimulating and productive. But this is, without question, a hard history. You may feel otherwise, and you can say so, in your closing remarks. But I think that your book has also invited us and invited readers more generally to imagine a different future, right? In terms of sort of like the necessity of helping and the necessity of being in the world. And so I think that even as you're, acknowledging and grappling with things that are difficult, it's also not the final word in terms of like what our, world looks like. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you. And I'll just close by saying thank you to Emily and to Korey and to Kathy and again, Madonna and Shane, and to all of you. I've really appreciated your questions, your comments. It's just, I'm really grateful for your engagement with the book. I'm grateful for disagreements with it. I really appreciate your perspectives and the conversation that it's provoked. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, it was a hard history, but a wonderful history and another wonderful conversation at the Seminar on American Religion. So I too want to thank you. I'm going to miss doing this an awful lot, but I know that I will see you all often and in many different places. So we'll just give a big round of applause to our panel and mark your calendars. See you in the fall.